Hey everyone, welcome back to my reviews of the Santa Claus show on Disney Plus. Today we're going to be covering episode 5. So if you don't want any spoilers, click off this video, go watch the episode and come back. But please do the second part. Also come back and watch this review because there are spoilers ahead. I bet you have no idea what I'm about to say because it's not like I've said it like 10 other times. Just like my other reviews, I'm going to be covering the nice, which is the stuff I like in the show and stuff that I like in this episode, the naughty, the stuff that I don't really like in the show and stuff in this episode. And then we're going to be doing a Bernard watch. And folks, there's a little Bernard in this episode, a little spice in there. So you're going to want to stick around for it. So let's start off with the good. I thought this was Cal and Sandra's strongest episode by far. I genuinely felt like how they were in this episode is how they should have been at the beginning of this season, minus Sandra's powers. It kind of sucks that it feels like the writers hit the reset button on both these characters, and it took us 5 entire episodes to get back to how they were at the end of last season. Cal had some great moments in this episode, and it was really nice to have moments with him that didn't just revolve around him being dumb. I get that his whole shtick is basically being like the dumb sibling, but I wish the show leaned more into him being smart. Because when he has clarity and is able to use his charisma, that's when his character is at its best. Like, it's pretty obvious that Cal is going to be the one that ends up turning Olga good, or at least he planted the seeds to allow her to turn eventually. And those are the moments that are genuine and feel like Cal's character at its best. And I won't lie, Cal hasn't been my favorite this season, but I was a little sad when he turned into a nutcracker. As for Sandra, I thought her teaming back up with La Befana was very sweet. I wasn't the biggest fan of the story arc at the beginning of the season, mainly due to the fact that we had so many stories going on at the same time. But we've had a little break from this, so it was a welcome return. And while it might have been a little obvious, I'm glad we finally got the confirmation that La Befana is/was a legendary figure. Another thing that I liked in this episode was the whole angle that if a Santa attacks another Santa, they end up nerfing each other's powers. It kind of creates a balance between them, but it does make me a little nervous about our final encounterment with Magnus Santos and Santa. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't get a lot of Santa on Santa action because they're both aware that if they attack each other, their powers are drained. So it will be interesting how that is used in the final episode if they end up fighting at all. Or if Magnus Santos just gets his amulet and then Santa being in the North Pole gives him power, they might just completely avoid all of this. But it's going to be interesting how they use this in the finale. Another thing that I'm interested in is how will the legendary figures be used in this next episode, or will they even be in the next episode? With Scott Calvin established as the new Santa, will they go after Magnus Santos, or will they stand pat because that's what they did originally? It will just be interesting how they use these characters, or even if they're going to show up, or if we're just going to get an off-screen line of we can't interfere. Like, it's just going to be interesting how they use them. And one last thing that I really liked in this episode, I liked the scene where Magnus Santos doesn't know the name of any of his elves. I just thought it was funny. It was a good scene. All right, now that I've talked about the nice and the good stuff, the stuff I like in this episode and throughout the show so far, let's move on to the naughty. As for the bad, I thought the whole plot of Betty telling the story of Magnus Santos was really boring. I get what they're trying to do, but so much of the story felt so redundant from all the flashbacks and the visions we've already had. And it felt like the only big reveal that they had left was La Befana being a legendary figure. And it just didn't feel like that big of a deal. It didn't feel as big as they thought it was going to be. It was just like, oh, okay. She was a legendary figure. I don't know. Maybe you felt like it was a bigger reveal than I did. It just didn't feel big to me. It felt like a major exposition dump, which is fine. It's not super creative, but that's not my problem with this. My problem is that they're telling us stuff we already knew. And then from a visual standpoint, these flashbacks just kind of look ugly to me. They all have these brown, grainy filters on them. It's just not for me. If you like it, that's totally fine. It just doesn't work for me. It felt like this episode was supposed to be our big lore episode, kind of like the Yuleverse episode last season, but it just didn't get close to clearing the bar. And from a visual standpoint, the Yuleverse episode was not like this visually beautiful episode. It felt cheap at points, but there were so many interesting and fun characters introduced that it helped with the lack of visual gravitas. And that just isn't really a thing in this episode. So I've done a lot of complaining about this section of the episode. And instead of complaining more, I want to talk about how I would have handled this section of the episode. I just want to preface this by saying you are completely entitled to your opinion about this section of the episode. If you love this section of the episode and you're like, this guy's an idiot, this was perfect, it doesn't need any changing, hey, more power to you. These are just two small tweaks I would have made to this section. Number one, show us Magnus Antis before he was Mad Santa. When Betty starts telling the story, she says that Magnus Antis was one of the greatest Santa Clauses ever. And then we immediately transition to our B story. We don't see anything. If you're going to say that Magnus Antis was one of the greatest Santas ever, show us him being a great Santa. I am the biggest advocate for letting bad Santa, mad Santa, whatever, be bad. Like, let him be bad. But if you're going to tell us he was one of the greatest Santas ever, we need to see that. We can't just let it be a throwaway line. Show him at his peak. Show him at his prime. It's very important. And number two, and this leads us right into the next section of this review, use Bernad more. I know what you're thinking. This guy, he's the biggest Bernad fan ever. Of course he wants Bernad to be the big hero that defeats Magnus Antis at the end, and he wants Bernad to show up. And that is not true. I don't even think that using Bernad more in these flashbacks involves him being there physically. I think it is completely fine if he just shows up with the picture of him and Magnus Antis and with the note to Betty. I think that's 100% fine. But I do think a way that you can use Bernad more in these flashbacks is to have him be the catalyst of why all of these elves we have in these flashbacks and in the show currently are not in the original movies. Let me explain. I feel like this show missed out on a very fun opportunity to establish why your Bettys and your Knowles and your Edys and your Garys aren't around during the original Santa Claus movies. And I get it. The actual logistical sense is that they weren't alive. These other movies were filmed a long time ago, and most of these kids were not even alive by then. But I'm talking about canon, that instead of Bernad just sweeping what they did and going against a Santa Claus under the rug, he has to banish them from the North Pole. Simply put, what these elves did to take out Magnus Antis is just way too freaking important for it to be just brushed under the rug. And it's just weird for them to just be background characters in these other movies, and it's way more interesting for them to just be gone. And this is when things get interesting. Bernad, in his infinite wisdom, knows that there is only one elf that is capable of being head elf after he leaves: Betty. But at this point, Bernad can't make Betty the head elf because she's not at the North Pole. So he decides to instead put in charge the worst possible head elf, Curtis. And then as Bernad leaves for Cribble Crabble and he puts Curtis in charge, he also brings in a new regime of elves, your Bettys, your Knowles, your Garys, your Edys, and tells Santa these are the best of the best. These are the best elves in the business. You are in great hands. And then once Curtis explodes, rip Curtis, Betty becomes head elf. And she's not the greatest head elf ever, but she's Bernard's pick. And you can't argue with Bernard's pick for head elf. He is the GOAT of head elves. So the too long did not read version of the fan fiction that I just wrote. Bernad is the puppet master controlling all of the elf aspects of the North Pole, which kind of sounds like Santa. I don't know. Maybe he should be the next Santa. I don't know if anyone has come up with that idea. He seems like a really great Santa anyway, but he's able to get Betty in the position she needs to be in at the exact moment. And also, I imagine he thought it would be hilarious to see Curtis explode from stress. It's a perfect story. All right. That's all I got. I don't know if this review was good at all. Honestly, like, I have complete scatterbrains after everything I just talked about. So if this was terrible and completely incoherent, I am very sorry. I'm planning on doing another live reaction of the finale for this season. That was super fun last season, and as long as my schedule allows it, I would love to do it again, so keep an eye out for that. It would be super fun if you're able to join. If you could leave this video a like, I would really appreciate it, and also leave a comment down below on your thoughts on this episode, and also what you think is going to happen in the finale. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you for episode 6, aka the finale.